Well, welcome to The Catholic Reason, a radio production of St. Michael Catholic Radio, based here in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, where we think through various claims made by the Catholic Church concerning issues of faith, morality, and sometimes culture, and provide reasons behind those claims. Hence the title of the program, The Catholic Reason. I'm Dr. Karlo Broussard, staff apologist and speaker for Catholic Answers, and a member of the Chancery Evangelization team here at the Diocese of Tulsa and Eastern Oklahoma. The Catholic Reason airs locally here in Tulsa every Thursday from 4 to 5 p.m. on St. Michael Catholic Radio 94.9 and 102.9, and even across the entire Oklahoma Catholic Radio network of 15 stations, including 97.3 FM in Oklahoma City, 100.9 in Edmond, and 88.3 FM in Lawton. But you may be listening at a different time on your own local Catholic station outside Oklahoma, since the Catholic Reason is aired on other Catholic stations throughout the country. Regardless of where you're at, a special welcome to you and thanks for joining me today. Note that you can download the show through whichever podcast platform that you use by subscribing to the Eastern Oklahoma Catholic Podcast. You can also access the archived episodes at my website, karlobroussard.com, under both the audio and video tab. And be sure to check out all the other great resources that I have available there for you at my website. So in last week's episode, we looked at a couple of challenges to the gospel portrait of Jesus. Today, I'd like to look at some more challenges, 3 in particular that we'll look at, and they are as follows. Number 1, Paul lacks historical information about Jesus, and for some, because of this, they conclude that the gospel portrait of Jesus is made up, not reliable. Secondly, the Gospels contain miracles. Since they contain miracles, so it's argued, we can't really trust them, that they're relaying to us, for us, accurate information about Jesus. And thirdly, the third challenge, the Jesus story is merely a copycat of mythic hero archetypes. So I'll take each of these challenges in turn throughout today's episode. And let's start with the first challenge. Recall, Paul lacks historical information about Jesus. So the idea here is that since Paul doesn't mention the biographical details of Jesus' life or his teachings, the gospel writers must have inserted these things into their gospels after Paul's letters were written, thereby indicating that the gospel portrait of Jesus was invented and thus not trustworthy. You can find this challenge put forward in many critical books of Christianity. 2 examples would be Earl Doherty in his book, The Jesus Puzzle, Did Christianity Begin with a Mythical Christ?, challenging the existence of the historical Jesus, and G.A. Wells's The Jesus Myth. Now, the first problem with this objection is its unreasonable expectation that we should find in Paul all the biographical, historical details of Jesus' life and teachings if the gospel portraits were true. The reason that this expectation is unreasonable is because Paul's epistles were written to address specific problems in the local churches and weren't for the purpose of giving the life story of Jesus. Paul would only have need to include such details of Jesus' life if they were helpful to him in solving whatever problem he was addressing in the local communities. Therefore, the expectation that Paul would have included many of the details of Jesus' life as we find them in the Gospels is unfounded. It's a false, unreasonable expectation. Moreover, as my colleague at Catholic Answers, Trent Horn, argues in his article, Did Jesus Exist?, to conclude that Paul didn't know about the historical Jesus because he has so little details would be like concluding that Luke didn't know about the historical Jesus because he has so little details about Jesus' earthly ministry in his book, The Acts of the Apostles. Since we shouldn't make this conclusion about Luke, given that he wrote an entire gospel about Jesus' life story and ministry, well, then we shouldn't make this conclusion about Paul. Now, the second problem with the objection is its assumption that Paul did not know and thereby did not include biographical information about Jesus, the Jesus of history, or the assumption that Paul did not include any references to Jesus' teachings. And this is simply contrary to fact. So let's take first the biographical details. We're going to target the assumption that Paul did not include any biographical details. The implication being that Paul didn't know about the historical Jesus, and so the portrait of Jesus that we find in the Gospels is therefore legendary and made up. So consider, for example, I'm going to share with you a list of biographical information taken from the book The Jesus Legend by scholars Paul Eddy and Gregory Boyd. So I'm going to just run through this list for you that I pulled from this resource, The Jesus Legend. Consider that Paul knew that Jesus was born and raised as a Jew. He records this in Galatians 4:4. Paul knew that Jesus was a descendant of Abraham and David. That's some biographical information. He states this in Galatians 3:16 and Romans 1:3. Paul knew that Jesus had a quote-unquote brother or relative named James. He documents this in Galatians 1:19. And the significance of this is that Paul definitely understood Jesus to be a person of recent history if he's saying that he knew Jesus' brother. It wouldn't make sense for him to talk of Jesus' brother and talking to Jesus' brother, knowing Jesus' brother, if Jesus were a figment of the imagination. Furthermore, Paul knew disciples ministered with Jesus. Paul knew that Peter was married. He tells us this in 1 Corinthians 9:5. Paul knew Jesus was betrayed, according to 1 Corinthians 11:23. Paul knew Jesus was executed by crucifixion. He documents this in 1 Corinthians 1:17 through 18 and Galatians 5:11. Paul knew that Judean Jews helped get Jesus crucified, according to 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 14 through 15. Paul knew that Jesus instituted a memorial meal that we call the Last Supper or the Eucharist. In 1 Corinthians 11:23 through 25, he indicates this. He makes this known. In 1 Corinthians 15:4 through 8, Paul talks about how he knew Jesus was buried and was seen by many of his disciples. Paul also knew Jesus was a man of meekness, gentleness, self-sacrificial love, and humble service, as related in 2 Corinthians 10:1 and Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 7. So that's a list of several places in Paul's corpus of writings where he indicates he knew certain biographical details about Jesus. And so that indicates to us that he believed Jesus was a person of recent history, that he was not a figment of the imagination or some legendary development, but was a real historical person with real life details. Now, not only does Paul directly reference certain biographical details about Jesus found in the Gospels, but Paul demands Christians to conform their lives to the model of Christ's life. He does this in 1 Corinthians 11:1, 2 Corinthians 8:9, 2 Corinthians 10:1, Romans 15:2 through 3, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 1, Philippians 2:5 through 7, and Philippians 3:8 through 10. Now, a question arises here. Well, how could Paul and the Christians to whom he writes desire to be like Jesus without having significant biographical information about Jesus? The answer is they couldn't. So that they do aspire to such imitation of Christ tells us that they knew a lot about the life of Christ. They had enough historical biographical information about Jesus such that they could desire to be like him as Christians. If they didn't have that sort of biographical information, it would not make sense. It would be unintelligible for them to have this desire to conform their lives like unto Christ. So the claim that Paul didn't include details, or even the claim that Paul didn't know about the details that we find in the Gospels, is simply false. Paul's letters, therefore, provide us independent, because all scholars recognize that Paul is writing independently of the Gospel writers, so he's providing us independent attestation to many Gospel details, which in turn disproves the idea that the Gospel writers were fabricating the Jesus story. So this provides at least some ground for the general trustworthiness of the Gospel portrait of Jesus. So Paul provides for us, Paul is a very important source, early Christian source, for us to affirm the Gospel portrait of Jesus. So let's now look at Paul's references to Jesus' teachings. So far, we've looked at Paul's references to the biographical information of Jesus, but we can also look to Paul's references of Jesus' teachings, that he was aware of Jesus' teachings. And what we're going to do, we're coming up on our first break, so we're going to have to pause here and pick back up on the other side. But when we come back from the break, we're going to look at Paul's letters to the Romans, his first letter to the Corinthians, and his first letter to the Thessalonians. And in these three letters, we find allusions to Jesus' teachings. So, my friends, I'm Dr. Karlo Broussard. You're listening to The Catholic Reason. Stay tuned. More to come on the other side of the break. Well, welcome back, my friends, to The Catholic Reason, a radio production of St. Michael Catholic Radio based here in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. In today's episode, we're looking at more challenges to the gospel portrait of Jesus. And the first challenge that we began to look at in our first segment of today's episode was Paul's so-called or alleged lack of historical information about Jesus. For some skeptics, they argue since Paul lacks historical information about Jesus, then he must not have known about the historical Jesus. And given this, the gospel portrait of Jesus that we find in the Gospels, or the portrait of Jesus that we find in the Gospels, must therefore be a legendary development or fabricated by the gospel authors, since the Gospels are writing or coming after, the gospel writers are writing after Paul. Now, in response, I said that how it's simply just an unreasonable expectation to find all the gospel details in Paul's letters. Since he's not writing about the life story of Jesus, he's dealing with specific issues or problems in the local churches. So it would be unreasonable to expect him to be including these details about Jesus' life. He would only include such details if it would benefit him to help solve a particular problem in one of the local churches. And then secondly, we can simply show how the assumption that Paul did not include biographical information about Jesus is simply false. And we gave a litany of examples in his corpus of writings where he does speak of certain biographical details of Jesus, corroborating what the gospel writers tell us, thereby providing us independent attestation to some of the gospel details. And that in turn establishes a general trustworthiness of the Gospels. Now, before our break, I mentioned that not only does Paul refer to certain biographical details about Jesus, indicating that he knew of the historical Jesus, but also he alludes to certain teachings of Jesus. And he does so in his letter to the Romans, 1 Corinthians, and 1 Thessalonians. So let's go through some of these just to kind of list them for you. Here's what we find in his letter to the Romans. So in Romans 12:14, he alludes to Jesus' words on blessing those who persecute you. And you can cross-reference that with Luke 5:27 through 28. In Romans 12:17, Paul alludes to Jesus' teaching on repaying no one evil for evil. And that's cross-referenced with Jesus' Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, verse 39. In Romans 13:7, Paul references or alludes to Jesus' teaching on paying taxes and related tribute, which can be cross-referenced with Mark chapter 12, verse 17. In Romans 13:8 through 9, Paul alludes to Jesus' teaching on loving one's neighbor as summarizing the whole law. Love of neighbor summarizes the whole law. This is found in Mark 12:31, Mark's record of Jesus' teaching there. And then you can also, Paul also alludes to this teaching in Galatians 5:14. So you got Romans 13:8-9, and Galatians 5:14 corresponding with Jesus' teaching recorded in Mark 12:31. In Romans chapter 14, verse 14, Paul alludes to Jesus' teaching on recognizing all foods as clean. Of course, this corresponds with Mark's record of Jesus' teaching in Mark chapter 7, verse 19, as well as Luke's record of this teaching in Luke chapter 11, verse 41. So those are some allusions or echoes of Jesus' teaching in Paul's letter to the Romans. What about 1 Corinthians? Well, here's a few references or echoes of Jesus' teaching in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. Paul quotes the words of Jesus from the gospel tradition on divorce and remarriage in 1 Corinthians 7:10. And you can cross-reference that with Mark chapter 10, verses 10 through 12. Because there Paul says, this is something I've received from the Lord, that we receive from the Lord, and it's not his own opinion. So he explicitly states the teaching is coming from Jesus. It's not a direct quote of Jesus' teaching, but he's saying it's coming from Jesus' teaching. Now, what's interesting here is that Paul distinguishes his own instruction when it comes to concerning virgins remaining virgins from Jesus' teaching concerning divorce and remarriage. Paul makes it very clear the issue about no divorce and remarriage coming from Jesus and the counsel of virgins remaining virgins coming from himself. He expressly communicates that he is not putting words into Jesus' mouth. And if Paul didn't do this, well, then we can reasonably infer that the gospel writers didn't do it either. Paul was very conscious of what is coming from him and what is coming from Jesus. And if Paul is conscious of that, and Paul is going through great pains to make that distinction, well, then we can infer that the gospel writers would have done the same. And so that provides us yet further reason to conclude that the gospel writers are not fabricating the story of Jesus, that they're conscious of what is coming from Jesus and what is not. All right. Now, in 1 Corinthians 9:14, Paul echoes the teaching of Jesus concerning receiving money for ministry, and that corresponds with Luke's record of Jesus' teaching on that in Luke chapter 10, verse 7. Paul also echoes Jesus' teaching on the Last Supper, extensively so. In 1 Corinthians 11:23-25, Paul records the very words of the Last Supper, and then goes on to give instruction about receiving the Eucharist. And of course, the words of institution in the Last Supper corresponds with Luke's record of that in Luke chapter 22, verses 19-20. So in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, he alludes to several teachings of Jesus. Finally, here are some echoes of Jesus' teachings in Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians. In 1 Thessalonians 2:14-15, he echoes Jesus' teaching about the persecution of Judean Christians by their kinsfolk, and is close to a quotation which corresponds to Matthew 23:29-38. That's Matthew's record of Jesus' teaching, again, concerning the persecution of Judean Christians by their kinsfolk. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 15 through chapter 5, verse 4, Paul echoes Jesus' teaching on the return of Christ. And that, of course, maps on with Matthew's record of Jesus' teaching on this in chapter 24, especially verse 43. Of course, that's the famous text of being caught up with the Lord in the air, which some Protestants will appeal to as justification for the rapture, but that's a whole other issue. I've dealt with that already in a previous episode of The Catholic Reason. But here, the point here is that Paul is echoing this teaching of Jesus about his coming in Matthew chapter 24. So these echoes of Jesus' teaching provides us evidence that at least when it comes to these teachings, the gospel writers didn't merely fabricate the teachings and put them into Jesus' mouth. And if they didn't do it with these teachings, well, then we can reasonably trust that they didn't do it with other teachings of Jesus. Now, some may counter to these echoes of Jesus' teachings, or at least wonder honestly, why doesn't Paul ever cite Jesus' teaching explicitly? So you'll note that in all of the examples that I just gave in his letter to the Romans, 1 Corinthians, and 1 Thessalonians, these were echoes or allusions to Jesus' teachings, but never a direct citation or quotation. So why is that the case? Well, one answer, proposed by Eddy and Boyd in their book, The Jesus Legend, is that Paul was simply following the Greco-Roman common practice of, quote-unquote, traditional referentiality. I repeat, traditional referentiality, which basically was a way of referencing traditions received by allusions and echoes rather than direct quotation. That was just simply par for the course. That was the common practice of the time. This was common among predominantly oral cultures. And so that provides a reasonable explanation as to why Paul is not directly citing or quoting Jesus, but mere alluding to these teachings. Now, another answer, proposed by scholar Michael Thompson, is that Paul's primary purpose in writing his letters was to exhort his readers not to argue theological points. As Se-Yoon Kim points out in his entry for the dictionary, or his entry in the dictionary of Paul in his letters, he writes this, quote, Jesus the sayings of, or the entry is Jesus the sayings of. So here's what Kim writes concerning this, the sayings of Jesus. Again, this is in the dictionary of Paul in his letters. Kim writes, in paraenesis, or exhortations, unlike in theological argument, one normally does not prove the truth of one's teaching, and so it's not required to cite its sources. That's on page 489 of the Dictionary of Paul and his letters. Now, Kim goes on to point out, however, that when Paul was conscious when Paul was that his views would have been contrary to his own, he did allude to Jesus' teaching for justification. So sometimes Paul does appeal to Jesus' teaching to justify his own view when he's conscious that this would have been contrary to others. And we see examples of this in Romans 14:14, 1 Corinthians 7:10 through 11, 1 Corinthians 9:14, and Galatians 5:14. Now, another possible reason why Paul doesn't cite Jesus' teachings is because his letters aren't oriented to evangelism. Rather, as we mentioned earlier, he's dealing with problems among Christians. And so that would provide a reason, perhaps, of why he doesn't need to directly cite Jesus. But more on this on the other side of the break. My friends, I'm Dr. Karlo Broussard. Stay tuned. You're listening to The Catholic Reason. Well, welcome back, my friends, to The Catholic Reason. In today's episode, we're looking at more challenges to the gospel portrait of Jesus. The first challenge that we've been looking at so far in today's episode is the argument that Paul lacks historical information on Jesus in his letters, which indicates to us that he probably did not know about the historical Jesus, and that further gives reason for some skeptics to conclude that the portrait of Jesus in the Gospels is therefore fabricated or made up, since the Gospel writers are giving us their reports on Jesus' life after the letters of St. Paul. Now, we responded to this in several ways already, and before our last break, we were responding to the objection by showing that some of the assumptions are simply false, namely the assumption that Paul doesn't include any biographical information about Jesus, and we gave a litany of examples that proves that assumption false. And then also, part and parcel of this objection is that Paul doesn't even allude to Jesus' teachings. The assumption being that Paul wasn't aware of any teachings of Jesus, so he probably wasn't historical to begin with, or wasn't aware of the historical Jesus. But in response to that, we gave several examples in Paul's letters to the Romans, 1 Corinthians, and 1 Thessalonians that Paul is aware of many of the teachings of Jesus. He alludes to them or echoes them in a variety of different passages. But before the break, we raised the question, well, why doesn't Paul cite them explicitly? One potential explanation as to why he doesn't do that is he's just simply following the Greco-Roman practice of what is referred to as traditional referentiality, where the ancient authors were not expected to cite things explicitly, but echoes and allusions sufficed. So that provides a reason, possibly why he's not citing them explicitly. We also said that the purpose of Paul's letters were to exhort, not to argue theologically. And since he's not attempting primarily to argue theological points, there's no need to appeal to Jesus to justify those points. However, we mentioned that whenever Paul is aware that there will be some views contrary to his own, he does appeal to Jesus in certain circumstances to justify his points. And then finally, we were mentioning right before the break is that Paul's letters were not oriented to evangelism, but rather he was dealing with problems among Christians. Scholars have argued that according to the historical record, it seems that the gospel material was primarily used to evangelize, not necessarily to settle theological or disciplinary issues. W.A. Strange makes a case for this in his 2000 article, The Jesus Tradition in Acts, in the journal New Testament Studies. The purpose of Paul's letters, on the other hand, was not to evangelize, like it was for the gospel writers, but to exhort and solve communal issues. Given the research from Strange, it makes sense that Paul wouldn't be citing Jesus directly, like we find in the Gospels, because he wasn't attempting to evangelize, like in the case of the Gospels, but merely to settle communal issues. Eddy and Boyd make this argument also in their book, The Jesus Legend, on pages 231 to 232. So you can check out their take on this argument there. So we have plausible explanations as to why Paul would not explicitly cite the Jesus tradition, other than him not being aware of the historical Jesus or not caring about him. Because remember, that's the charge, right? Jesus doesn't cite the historical Jesus in his teachings directly, and so therefore Paul must not have been aware of the historical Jesus or didn't really care about the historical Jesus. But of course, there are other explanations, reasonable explanations, as to why Paul did not directly cite Jesus. So, given that Paul does provide some biographical details about Jesus, and, as we've shown, even echoes some of Jesus' teachings, we can conclude that the gospel portrait of Jesus that we have in the Gospels was faithfully preserved in the oral traditions from which the Gospels are pulling. Paul's witness to these details gives us good reason to trust the gospel portrait of Jesus. He provides for us an independent source that verifies, confirms, corroborates, attests to many of the gospel details. So again, that oral tradition from which the gospel writers are pulling was faithfully preserved concerning Jesus' life and his teaching. All right, now, so that completes our response to the first challenge. Another reason, let's move to the second challenge. Another reason why many doubt the gospel portrait of Jesus is because it presents Jesus as a miracle worker. For these sort of people, that these reports contain miracles automatically indicates they're the stuff of legend. For example, the late German Lutheran theologian Rudolf Bultmann stated concerning Jesus' resurrection in his essay, New Testament and Mythology, in the book Kerygma and Myth, a Theological Debate. Here's what Bultmann writes. But what of the resurrection? Is it not a mythical event, pure and simple? Obviously, it's not an event of past history. So notice that he automatically concludes it's not history precisely because it's a miracle. It's mythical because it's a miracle. John Dominic Crossan picks up Boltman's mantle, stating in his book, Jesus, A Revolutionary Biography, on page 82, quote, "Jesus did not and could not cure that disease or any other one." And then he later adds on page 95, "I do not think that anyone, anywhere, at any time, brings dead people back to life." So for Crossan, the gospel portrait of Jesus is going to be not trustworthy, untrustworthy. It's not going to be reliable. It's not going to be historical, precisely because it is not possible for these sorts of miracles to be performed. In the book, The Five Gospels, What Did Jesus Really Say? The Search for the Authentic Words of Jesus, the Jesus Seminar joins rank with Boltman and Crossan, making several comments against the gospel reports of supernatural events. So here's what they say on page 25 of that book. Whenever scholars detect detailed knowledge of post-mortem events in sayings and parables attributed to Jesus, they're inclined to the view that the formulation of such sayings took place after the fact. So notice, the miraculous events and sayings of Jesus must have come after the fact, precisely because these things are supernatural. Later in the same book, the seminar goes beyond mere inclination, as it was stated there, and states that in principle, no gospel teaching from the resurrection accounts are legit sayings of Jesus. And here's their reason. This is on page 398 of the aforementioned book. By definition, words ascribed to Jesus after his death are not subject to historical verification. So skeptics reject the gospel portrait of Jesus because they contain the miraculous. But we're going to have to ask the question, is this a good reason to reject the reliability of the Gospels? And I'm going to answer no, I don't think so. Just because the Gospels record or include miracles, it doesn't follow that they're not historical. Now, my first response here is the mere presence of miracle narratives in the Gospels would be a good reason to reject their legitimacy if and only if miracles were metaphysically impossible. And I want to point out that this principle in and of itself is not a bad methodology. Like the idea that if something is metaphysically impossible, and you have this source containing the metaphysical impossibility, well, then it would be reasonable to reject them as historically reliable. There's nothing wrong with that methodology, so I argue. For example, if I have prior knowledge that it's metaphysically impossible for something to both be and not be in the same respect at the same place and time, and the Gospels throughout their writings, throughout their stories, constantly affirm something to exist and not exist in the same respect and at the same place and time, well, then I would have good reason to reject the trustworthiness of such reports. So the success of this argument, the argument that states the Gospels are not historically trustworthy because they contain miracles, hinges on whether miracles are in fact metaphysically impossible. But the metaphysical impossibility of miracles for skeptics is not due to an alleged violation of the principle of non-contradiction. Rather, miracles are alleged to be impossible because of their prior belief, the skeptic's prior belief, that God doesn't exist. And this, at least, is logically sound. You can't have some wondrous effect that requires divine power, which is what a miracle is, if there's no divine power. But if God did exist, well, then miracles would be at least possible. And if that's the case, well, then the mere presence of miracle narratives would not be a good reason to reject the gospel portraits of Jesus. On this view, the gospel portrait of Jesus still could be reliable even though it has miracle narratives. And so what this tells us is that the argument against the gospel portrait of Jesus from miracles is not about whether the gospel reports are historically trustworthy. Rather, it's about whether God exists or not. Thus, the charge that the Gospels aren't historically reliable because they contain miracle narratives is a moot point. It's distracting from the real question at hand for the skeptic. Are miracles metaphysically possible or not? And as I've already mentioned, that can only be determined by settling the God question. So rather than assessing the historical reliability of the Gospels, we would first have to be engaging in a philosophical discussion of whether God exists or not. And the answer to that question is going to determine whether miracles are possible or not. Friends, I'm coming up on my break here. Stay tuned. More to come on the other side. Well, welcome back, my friends, to our last and final segment of today's episode of The Catholic Reason. Before our last break, we began to look at the challenge that the Gospels contain miracles. And since they contain miracles, they can't be considered trustworthy. Our first response to that was, this objection is really not about the historical trustworthiness of the Gospels, but is more so a God question. Because if God does exist, well, then miracles would be possible. And if miracles are possible, well, then the presence of miracle narratives in the Gospels would not be a reason to reject them as historically trustworthy. So the historical nature of the Gospels is a moot point because we have to first settle the question of whether God exists or not. Now, this first critique of the objection prompts us to offer a second critique. Namely, these skeptics pride themselves in being skeptical or critical, and yet they're not very critical or skeptical when it comes to their presuppositions or assumptions. They just assume it's true. As Eddie and Boyd point out in their book, Lord or Legend, Wrestling with the Jesus Dilemma, this assumption that miracles are impossible has not been shared by most people throughout history, and it remains unshared by most people today, including the vast majority of people in contemporary Western culture. So given that our skeptic friends hold the minority view that there is no transcendent and thus miracles are metaphysically impossible, perhaps they would do well to critically assess whether their own presupposition is true and a worthy starting point for critical historiography. So it's kind of a double standard here. They're being very critical of our position, but they're not being as equally critical of their own presuppositions. And finally, in response to this, skeptics tend not to follow their own standard when it comes to other historical reports. Consider, for example, Julius Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon River as he returned from Gaul to Italy in 49 BC. Historians look to this event as an uncontested historical fact from the ancient world, an event that had great historical significance. This event forever changed the Roman Empire. Yet, according to the Roman historian Suetonius, it contains a miraculous element. Suetonius reports that the reason Caesar decided to cross the Rubicon was because he saw, quote, an apparition of superhuman size and beauty who was sitting on the riverbank playing a reed pipe. Now, when historians come across these sort of miraculous details in the Gospels, they reject them out of hand. Well, why not apply the same standard to Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon? As Craig Blomberg puts it in his essay in the book Jesus Under Fire, clearly a double standard is at work here. If historians are not going to exclude Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon on account of miraculous elements present in the narrative, well then they ought not to reject the gospel portrait of Jesus simply on account of miraculous elements present in the narratives. Historian Paul Merkley put it succinctly in his 1986 article, The Gospels as Historical Testimony, in the journal Evangelical Quarterly, volume 58. He writes, the Gospels deserve to be treated at least as generously as any other purportedly historical narrative from the ancient world. The late British historian of ancient Rome, A.N. Sherwin-White, captured this idea nicely as well in his book, Roman Society and Roman Law in the New Testament, on page 187. Quote, it's astonishing that while Greco-Roman historians have been growing in confidence, the 20th century study of the gospel narratives, starting from no less promising material, has taken so gloomy a turn. So this objection, the objection that the Gospels contain miracles, runs afoul of a double standard, and that's problematic. So we have three responses there to the Gospels, the challenge of the Gospels containing miracles. It's more of a God question. They're not being critical enough of their own assumption about miracles. They're being critical of our assumption, but they're not being critical about their own assumption. And of course, the double standard of rejecting the gospel narratives on account of miracles, but not rejecting other ancient narratives on account of miraculous elements present within the narratives. Okay, now we come to our final challenge that we're going to consider in today's episode. And it's a challenge that argues that the gospel portrait of Jesus fits all the features of the mythic hero archetype. The mythic hero archetype is a recurring character type in mythology who often faces trials and tribulations, often of divine descent, and ultimately is victorious, bringing a sense of renewal or order back to the world. Such a character is often seen as the embodiment of human potential and strength to overcome adversity. Examples of such mythic heroes are Hercules, Odysseus, Beowulf, and King Arthur. Hercules is a Greek hero known for his defeat of different kinds of monstrous and dangerous creatures. Odysseus is a Greek hero from the Odyssey who has to overcome great difficulty in journeying home after the Trojan War. Beowulf, the legendary Anglo-Saxon hero, showcased great strength in his battle against and victory over the monstrous Grendel and Grendel's mother. King Arthur, of course, is the legendary British king who is known for chivalry and leadership, his quest for the Holy Grail, and his involvement with the Knights of the Round Table. Now, for a brief history on the hero myth theory, see Robert A. Siegel's chapter Introduction in Quest of the Hero in the book In Quest of the Hero, edited by Otto Rank, Lord Raglan, and Alan Dunes. Now, for some skeptics, since the Jesus story fits this mythic hero archetype, then the Jesus story must be merely a legend, simply legendary. New Testament scholar Robert Price takes this approach in his 1997 article, Crisis of Fiction. He writes this: every detail of the Christ story fits the mythic hero archetype, with nothing left over. It is arbitrary to assert that there must have been a historical figure lying in back of the myth. There may have been, but it can no longer be considered particularly probable. And that's all the historian can deal with: probabilities. So, what should we make of this challenge? It does seem that the gospel portrait of Jesus fits the mythic hero archetype. So the question becomes, is it reasonable to conclude from this that the Jesus story is not rooted in history? I answer no. And I'd like to give 4 reasons why. Reasons that I'm getting from Gregory Boyd and Paul Eddy in their book, Lord or Legend, Wrestling with the Jesus Dilemma. So this is not original to me. I'm utilizing their apologetical argumentation here, which I find quite persuasive. The first is that other historical figures like Abraham Lincoln, John F. Kennedy, and William, quote-unquote, Braveheart Wallace also fit the mythic hero features as well. Yet, we don't think these guys are non-historical figures. As Charles E. Murgia writes in his response to Dunes, conformity to a mythic pattern does not necessarily mean that the events did not occur. Here's the second reason why the mythic hero archetype objection fails. The Jesus story lacks a central mythic hero feature, namely, being an earthly heroic warrior or king. In fact, Jesus actually says his kingdom is not of this world. So he is not an earthly heroic king like is central to the mythic heroic archetype. Furthermore, the Jesus story contains features that are not classic traits of mythic heroes. Boyd and Eddy list the following as examples. Jesus was a teacher. Jesus was a healer. Jesus was an exorcist. These are not common to the mythic heroes. So there's a principle of dissimilarity here. If the gospel writers were just fabricating a story based on the mythic hero archetypes, well then it doesn't seem like they would have included these sorts of features. Since they did, we can conclude that they weren't merely influenced by the mythic hero archetypes. The point being is that you would think if they're being influenced by these archetypes, well then Jesus would have more of the features that are central to the archetypes and would not have features that are not found in the archetypes. Now, another reason why the mythic hero archetype objection fails is because it assumes the influence can only be in one direction, namely the mythic hero archetype influencing the Christian story of Jesus. But it's possible that the Christian story be that which influences the mythic hero archetype. Consider this. If the Jesus story is rooted in history, then Jesus would be the ultimate hero, the hero par excellence against whom all other heroes are measured, and the hero that fulfills the natural intuitions that we have as human beings as to what it means to be a hero. Thus, on supposition that such a hero is part and parcel of the divine plan, we could interpret the mythic hero archetypes as echoes of the Jesus story, expressions of a truth in mythic form that resides within our hearts, planted there by the divine. So the influence doesn't necessarily run in a single direction. It could be that the Christian story explains the mythic hero archetype rather than the mythic hero archetype explaining the Christian story. And that, of course, is dependent on whether the Christian story is historical, which is the ultimate question that we're asking. A skeptic, therefore, cannot appeal to the mythic hero archetype as a reason to reject the historicity of the Jesus portrait, since the historicity of the Jesus portrait could be a reason why we have the mythic hero archetype in the first place. And finally, the last reason why the mythic objection fails is it ignores the historical evidence that Christians put forward when making a case for the Jesus story. And so it just totally bypasses the whole historical case for Christianity. Well, my friends, that's all the time that we have for this week's episode of The Catholic Reason. We looked at 3 challenges to the gospel portrait of Jesus. Paul lacks historical information about Jesus. The Gospels contain miracles, and the Jesus story is a merely copycat of mythic hero archetypes. But my claim today is that all 3 challenges fail as reasons to reject the historicity of the Jesus portrait, because Paul does in fact give historical information about Jesus. The challenge for miracles is more about God, more about the God question, and the mythic hero objection takes down with it the historicity of other historical figures and just begs the question against the Christian. My friends, thanks for listening today. Tell a friend. I'll talk to you then next week on The Catholic Reason. God bless.